The living marine resources in the Caribbean Sea and Atlantic Ocean, the fish and shellfish in our rivers and lakes have fed our people and sustained our livelihood for centuries. The Caribbean tries to find the path to sustainable development. There are large obstacles: underemployment, poverty, food and nutrition insecurity, and poor housing and substandard living conditions. But as a creator of wealth and well-being, the fishing industry offers real opportunities for the region to grow its economies. Fishing and aquaculture create wealth, not only in jobs for fisherfolk, but thousands more in related industries. From making and servicing fishing boats and equipment to processing, transporting, wholesale and retail, and export marketing of seafood business to tourism. The Caribbean fisheries industry employs thousands of people in rural communities, contributes to our food security, and earns foreign exchange. Its contribution to our economies is huge. It's estimated that on average, the fisheries sector accounts for as much as 6% of GDP in some Caribbean countries. And there's the value of fish and seafood in our nutrition. For countries like Grenada, Guyana, Barbados, and Suriname, as much as 10% of protein comes from fish and seafood products. But despite increasing demand by both consumers and the tourism industry, the amount of fish and seafood we produce in the Caribbean is falling. Over the last 4 decades, the fisheries industry has only shown marginal economic activity. Tackling these and many other issues for Caribbean fisheries and coming up with solutions that work is the business of the Caribbean Fisheries Forum, the main technical and scientific decision-making body of the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. The annual meeting of the forum in 2014 was held in Rosa, Dominica in late April. The forum brings together fisheries officials and fisherfolk organizations from 17 member countries, as well as observers and regional partners for 3 days of talks. The forum not only discussed how to deal with those obstacles to developing a sustainable fisheries and aquaculture industry, but harnessing their potential so they can contribute to even greater wealth and well-being for Caribbean people. Milton Houghton is the CRFM's executive director. For him, the forum's meeting comes at a particularly crucial time in our history.
The fisheries sector offers significant potential for making enhanced contribution to our economic development, to provide employment, to undergird our food security, etc. We need to work together, and we need to be clear on the areas that we're going to be working on together, the principles that will guide our collaborative actions, and the standards that we will use in working together so that we can be more effective in achieving our objectives.
Some of the obstacles to the development of regional fisheries come from outside the region, as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, crimes against our marine resources over which the region is struggling to gain control.
We have marine resources under our jurisdiction, and in many cases these are being dissipated, they are being abused and by foreigners, but also by some of our own people in terms of the way they carry out their operation. They ignore the law, and they conduct their fishing operation in such a way that is undermining the efforts to ensure conservation and sustainable use and long-term benefits to society. So they're actually harming the industry, and we have to stamp that out, because these resources are very important. If we manage them properly, they can make significant contribution to our economic development, our food and nutrition security, foreign exchange earning, livelihoods of coastal and coastal communities, or fishermen, and very important in eradicating poverty. A lot of people who are poor find their way in the fishing industry and are able to make reasonable livelihoods from it. So as a part of our strategy to deal with poverty, we have to look at the fisheries sector. It's really our social security net in many countries.
Another threat to one of the region's most popular delicacies is looming. The Caribbean spiny lobster, once seen as bait for other fisheries, is now one of the most highly prized luxury seafood and important economic fishery in the region. It is valued at over $456 million annually. The Bahamas, Haiti, Belize, Jamaica, and Turks and Caicos are the major lobster producers in the region. Recent research indicates that industry could be threatened by disease. Dr. Mark Butler, a professor and eminent scholar with Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, says he and his team have been studying the spiny lobster for more than 30 years, looking at diseases within the lobster population and how these populations are connected, which could lead to spread of the disease.
This is a disease. It's the first known virus that infects any species of lobster in the world, and our team first discovered it in the Florida Keys, and we've since now looked at around 25 or so places around the Caribbean. There are a few places where it seems to be fairly prevalent, fairly high. It's a disease of juveniles, so it's mostly the very small lobsters that get it. Adults can be carriers, and it's transmitted mostly by contact, given that lobsters are social. They can, when they cohabitate, sit in a den together, they can actually get it, just like we would transfer a cold by sneezing on one another or something like that. And then it also can be transported a little bit in the water. Now, places that like Florida, Mexico, there's some places in Cuba where the incidence seems to be fairly high. Many places in the Eastern Caribbean, like here in Dominica, we don't really see very high prevalence of this disease. But we're concerned about it, just want to keep an eye on it. There's nothing that I think we need to be overly concerned about. It doesn't seem like it's a disease that's increasing in abundance, but it is very lethal to the juveniles, and if it is in an area, it can be pretty detrimental to a fishery. And so what we want to do is be vigilant, keep an eye on this, and make certain that it isn't spread in any particular fashion by fishing.
Dr. Butler says if the disease is detected, not much can be done, so it is important to minimize human involvement.
We tend to think of diseases as not being very important out in nature, but in fact diseases, just like in human populations, when diseases go rampant, they can be very destructive. And so there are other examples of other crustacean fisheries around the world where diseases have had tremendous impacts on the fisheries. One of the most recent ones is just in the last 10 years in southern New England. There's a different type of disease called a shell disease that's had huge impacts on the fishery of clawed lobster in southern New England. And in fact, there have been calls to shut down fisheries entirely because there's such a huge problem with the disease in those areas. It's not that the fishermen really have done anything to cause problems with the disease, but really if you think about it, it's the only thing we can control is the amount of fishing effort that's being applied to a population. And so there are cases where diseases can be problems in crustacean fisheries, and we just want to avoid that in the Caribbean.
Queen conch is one of the largest mollusks traditionally and commercially fished in the Caribbean. It is also considered a delicacy used as a soup, starter, salad, or entree. Overfishing was a concern in the early 1990s with the species listed by the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. The intention was to regulate trade and support the sustainable use and survival of queen conch through scientific monitoring and management. The CRFM has teamed up with other organizations to promote regional cooperation in management involving all countries where queen conch is located. However, since 2012, an international non-governmental organization, Wild Earth Guardians, based in Colorado, is petitioning the U.S. government to have queen conch listed as an endangered species in accordance with the U.S.'s Endangered Species Act.
Now, if this petition were to succeed and the U.S. government recognized the queen conch as an endangered species, it would immediately shut down our export of queen conch into the United States. And the United States is the main market for our queen conch. Now, I think we need to give a little background. In the United States, the queen conch stocks have more or less been decimated. But that is not the case in the Caribbean countries. Our countries, we have significant stocks in Belize, in Jamaica, Turks and Caicos, Bahamas, etc. And we have in place in many of our countries, the countries where the queen conch is important, we have in place reasonably good and, in my opinion, in some cases, best practice in the world in terms of conservation and management of the queen conch. Of course, the U.S. is looking at the queen conch over its entire range. And so we acknowledge that in some parts of the range, in some countries, the situation is not as good as in the Caribbean region. But the approach that would mean you penalize those who have done the things that they ought to do in strengthening the management and governance arrangement, that you punish them because of the action of those who are negligent, is just wrong. In our opinion, there is no scientific justification for this action.
Mr. Horton says there's recourse for the region.
The U.S. has initiated a review process. They have recruited some scientists who are looking at the scientific information to determine whether or not, on the basis of the scientific information, on the basis of the management systems that are in place, whether or not this action petitioned by the NGO is really warranted. There are coastal communities, there are businesses, there are processing plants in the region that provide employment for thousands of people and thousands of families that are dependent on the Queen Conch resources and the export of Queen Conch for their livelihoods. So the loss would not only be in the earnings from the sale of conch, in the United States. It would be the loss in employment opportunities for our coastal communities and thousands of families that depend on the resources for their livelihood. So it is a very serious matter for us.
Amidst these challenges, fishing sectors like those in Dominica are turning to tried and true initiatives to boost catches, like reintroducing the Fish Aggregating Device, or FAD project.
We had a FAD program before. We tried a FAD program before, and that failed because we did not have the legislation to enforce these regulations. And that is why one of the reasons why it failed. And I'm hoping and praying that with this new one that's coming up, we will not have that same type of problem.
Mr. Vidal says the project is supported by the Caribbean Fisheries Management Project, along with the Japan International Cooperation Agency.
What this project intends to do is it's going to alleviate a lot of problems. Right now, the individual fishermen put the FADs and they do not want anybody else to go there, and that causes a conflict. So what we intend to do is to be responsible for putting FADs throughout the island. And we would manage it and maintain it. And we're hoping that it's not passed yet. We're hoping through legislation that we would have an annual license fee of about $500. So all the fishermen has to do is pay a $500 license fee every year, and you'll be entitled to fish on those FADs. I mean, this would be a great relief because a FAD in itself, to put a FAD down, costs over $3,000. So it would be a very big relief for the fat fishers when that is implemented.
In the meantime, Mr. Vidal says his members are still faced with other obstacles like high fuel costs and issues of safety.
When hurricanes approach, we have no means of taking the boats out of the water, and that is a serious challenge. During Hurricane Omar, I mean, practically about 75% of the fishing boats were destroyed. And this is one thing we need to have. Plus, there's you might have heard about the two young guys who lost their lives recently from a fishing trip. They went to put up a FAD and did not come back, aged 22 and 25. They were bona fide fishermen, very avid fishermen, and they did not come back. And we are saying that safety equipment should be made duty-free without VAT as well, so that people can afford to buy it, so that when they go 20 miles out, they're at least secure. We also want to have a base station here, a VHF base station here, so that when they get their VHF radio, at least it will be reasonable so they can go buy it. Then they have communication when they pass the capacity or the capability of cell phones. Then they can relate with the base station, which would be manned 24 hours a day, so somebody can be there to hear the cry and try to see what we can do about it.
While Dominica may be holding its own, countries like Curacao, which has flagging foreign exchange reserves and a hefty food import bill, is looking to develop its local fishing industry for export. Fishing and farming only account for 1% of the Dutch country's $2.84 billion GDP, with high imports from its southern neighbor Venezuela.
Yeah, we're working on the economic development from Curacao, and one of the pillars that we want to develop for the coming year are one of the fishery, mainly international fishery, in order to get more export regarding the economy itself, because we confront right now some problem with foreign exchange. This is the idea. By developing this sector, we will earn more foreign exchange in order to get the economy a little bit more stable on the side from the island.
A senior economic advisor, Girigori, said Curacao intends to join the CRFM.
In developing the international fishery, we have to comply with several rules regarding the EU itself. But in order to do that in a manageable and responsible way, it is a great need for Curacao to be part of this organization in order for us to making, or in any case catching fish on a sustainable way, in order to guarantee the future generation to getting also getting some profit from this activity, and to manage the resources that we have within the Caribbean Sea.
As the region moves ahead to strengthen the fisheries sector, Peter Murray, CRFM's Program Manager for Fisheries Management, says another key issue is development planning.
How do we plan the way forward for the fisheries sector? What roles do we play? Take on board the other information from other areas, the science and the community aspects, and so link them together, as it were, into a mosaic that leads towards improved development of the sector. The management considerations, again, bringing the science to the policy, linking the science with the policy so that you have management measures in place. What are they? What are the optimum ways of handling it? Those are the types of things that I look at. It's fairly broad and encompassing.
Mr. Murray says all this comes under the ambit of the CARICOM Common Fisheries Policy, which will foster greater inter-regional cooperation and opportunities for increased benefits in individual and collective states, while promoting the long-term resource sustainability.
Which is a document that tries to bring together the general statement of intent with regard to where the countries see we're going in terms of fisheries management, the principles involved, the issues that need to be considered, in a sense, the yeas and nays in terms of fisheries development. And I think the policy framework on which, of course, you can then go on to base legislation, on which you can look at the harmonization of approaches, on which you can even determine things as simple as who gets to fish. You know, all of these things are provided for under the framework of that general policy. Now, the general policy is now in draft. It has been approved most of the way along the required protocols, but one last step. It has been done as a treaty to give it weight, to give it international weight, to give it legal binding force. It's been done as a draft treaty. It means that the countries need to sign on to it. And the Honorable Prime Ministers are at present looking at it from other perspectives to ensure, notwithstanding that they've had the approval of the Legal Affairs Committee of the Caribbean Community, which is the committee made up of Attorneys General, notwithstanding that, the heads of government are now taking another look at it, and prior, we hope to sign it fairly shortly, so it becomes, in fact, a part of the legal system and of the Caribbean Community member states.
While regional governments have signed on to the policy mandated by CARICOM close to a decade ago, it was not signed at the 25th Intersessional Meeting of CARICOM heads in March in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The policy will be high on the agenda of the 8th meeting of the CRFM Ministerial Council meeting, also to be held in Roseau, Dominica on May 23rd.
The Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism was designed just as that, a mechanism. It's not seen as just being countries talking. It's supposed to be the member countries represented at different levels, the technical level by the chief fisheries officers in the forum, this meeting, and the political directorate in the Ministerial Council. In addition to the countries, you have the partner agencies, educational agencies, funding agencies. You also have stakeholder groups, the fishers, for example, the CNFO, an important part of it. So it's a mechanism. The Secretariat services that mechanism. A meeting like this brings the parties together to chart that way forward. It is of paramount importance. It is the decisions made here that will determine what the Secretariat does, and that will have an influence at the ministerial level. So the discussions here where the technical people, where the stakeholders, where the scientific community, where the institutions of higher learning bring their knowledge, their collective knowledge to bear. And it is that collective knowledge that can drive the process of fisheries management at the regional level to ensure a number of things. Sustainability of the resource, but more importantly, the nutrition and livelihood issues, food security issues, the questions of lives and livelihoods, the questions of looking to the future. Because basically what this is about, it's not just about fishing now for now. It's about providing these very important things for the future generations of members of our community, our Caribbean community, and the extended Caribbean identity. It's very, very important, and that is where you bring it all together before going up for the policy decision and feeding back, I hate to say it, downwards for action on the ground.
CRFM is doing a great job, an excellent job. We have been. It's nice to know that we've been invited to this forum. I think it's the first I know of that a national association has been invited to address a forum such as this, and I think it's testament of our ability to govern, and we're quite capable of dealing with matters of that concern. And I'm glad too, because I'm so happy that is, and I'm hoping, and my report I would say that I hope this become an agenda item, especially when you have the fisher folks' voice talking directly to the ministers, and that is important. For example, there are certain things that Mr. McLaughlin might not be able to express because he is part of government, but we being an independent, quasi-independent body, we can speak about those issues. And for example, one of these came out during the meeting, that there was a problem with the government not doing what they're supposed to do, not signing on to stuff for 11 years, and they can't sign on to those type of things. And Mitch Lee, who is the chairman of our Caribbean Network of Fisher Folk Organization, and I had that in my report as well, brought up the idea that you guys might not be able to do anything, but we can do something. And that is what I'm talking about. So it was so refreshing and nice to know that we're invited to such forums and we can express directly to our minister exactly how we feel.
The future of fishing in the Caribbean needs a sound roadmap to progress. That roadmap is the Caribbean Community Common Fisheries Policy, to be formally adopted by CARICOM heads of government. The policy is hailed as a progressive agreement for managing shared fisheries resources through cooperation. But the Caribbean Fisheries Forum agreed that for the policy to be effective, it needs more advocacy, a plan to make more people aware of it, and systems in place in each member country. In the Eastern Caribbean, a system to manage one special fish is already pointing the way to how the policy can work. It's a plan endorsed by the Forum for regional integration on conserving and managing flying fish in the Eastern Caribbean. When the plan is presented to the Ministerial Council for their endorsement and signature, there will also be a resolution issued by the Flying Fish Ministerial Subcommittee. All this work points the way forward for a new era of fisheries management in the region, a new era of cooperation, of pooling resources and wisdom, of sharing science and practical experience. It's an era begun by the Caribbean Fisheries Forum.